Morning, Martin.
Welcome to the Explorers Club Monday Night Lectures. We have a wonderful talk tonight from Mark Piesing in Oxford on a very unusual subject, getting to the North Pole in a lighter-than-air Airbus. My name's Martin Green. I'm a fellow of the Explorers Club. I'm a former member of the Library Committee. And could we have the first slide? And I'm going to tell you a little bit of history for an introduction here. Next slide, please. I'm talking to you from Seattle. My passion is the history of polar exploration. That's why I'm in the Explorers Club. And here is my library in Seattle. Next slide. I'm going to tell you a little bit about lighter than air balloons and Airbuses. There's nothing new here. The Chinese 1800 years ago had sky lanterns. Paper lanterns with a little fire inside, heated the air. They rose up in the air and they used them for important events. Slide. But the first manned balloon were the Montgolfier brothers from France, 1783. And they built this incredible balloon, decorated for King Louis. It has a gondola beneath it where they were in it, and they had a little fire with wood that heated the air. Slide. But what we're going to talk now is about reaching the North Pole with balloons and airships. Very unusual topic. Let's talk about the North Pole. Slide. And this is a long story. This goes back for over 400 years when Willem Barents was trying to get toward the North Pole. Of course, everybody who went north eventually ran into ice with their ships, and they knew they couldn't get there. But this goes back 400 years. But he discovered Spitsbergen. And I'm going to tell you about Spitsbergen, where it is and what it is. Next slide. Spitsbergen is directly north of Scandinavia. It's a set of islands, and it's called Svalbard now, and it's now owned by Norway. Many islands there, and they range from 75 up to 81 degrees north latitude. And that's one of the places where people went to try to get to the North Pole. So we're going to talk about Spitsbergen and Svalbard. Next slide, please. And it's a beautiful place. Polar bears, slide, walruses, should go there. So let me tell you about people who tried to get to the North Pole. First, a Swede named Solomon Andrée. This is 125 years ago. And he tried to get to the North Pole with a hydrogen balloon from Spitsbergen. Next slide. I'm a book person, so there's books on Andrée in all different languages, Swedish, slide, English, slide. And here's Andrée in the middle, and the two men that went with him, Strenberg and Frankel, are on the left and right. Slide, please. And here's their balloon. This was made in France, and it was sewed together, had a gondola beneath it. It was called Ernan, or the Eagle. Slide. And of course, it was sewed together by pieces of fabric, so it had jillions of needle holes in it, and they had to keep it from leaking. And this shows them trying to cover all the leaks with fabric, leaks from the fabric. Slide, please. There's a Russian book. All of Europe knew about this expedition. Slide. Here's a French book, and this shows their ship leaving Gothenburg, Sweden. This ship here, and it's carried all their equipment and the balloon from France up north to Spitsbergen. Slide, please. Here's a beautiful little handkerchief that was made in Sweden to commemorate this voyage, this expedition. Slide, please. So what did they do? In this ship, they had to bring all this equipment to make hydrogen. They brought iron, they brought sulfuric acid, they brought all these metal tanks, and they had to assemble them in Spitsbergen at 80 degrees north latitude. Amazing. Slide, please. And then they started to fill the balloon. They built a container for the balloon and started to fill it with hydrogen. Slide, please. And the balloon got bigger. Slide. And they had a gondola with ballast bags, and they had steering ropes which hung down and dragged on the ice to steer. They failed. They fell off, actually. Slide, please. But here's the balloon taking off. You can see the ropes down beneath it in 1897. They tried in 1896, but the winds were all going from north to south rather than the other direction. Slide, please. And here's an actual photograph of the Eagle on its way north in 1897. Slide, please. They had a carrier pigeon with them. They released the carrier pigeons, and that came back. They dropped a buoy, and that came back, but they didn't come back. Slide, please. What happened? The balloon went 2.5 days. It crashed onto the ice. It got covered with ice and got heavy. Hydrogen leaked out, and it crashed. Slide, please. So where did they go? They didn't go very far. They actually, and going on the next slide too is a better picture. They actually went only 3 degrees north latitude from where they started. They still had 7 degrees to get to the North Pole, 490 miles, and the balloon crashed. And there they were in the middle of nowhere. They decided they would try to walk back. This is a picture of Andrée. Where did they get these pictures? I'll tell you. Well, 33 years later, these men were found. Slide. They walked back and they were found on Kvitoya or White Island 33 years later by a sealing team. They found a body, they found some wreckage, and they realized this was Solomon Andrée's team. Slide. The thing they found was their clothes, their logbooks. They found the 3 bodies. Slide, please. But they also found cameras and undeveloped film. And that film was taken back to Sweden and developed, and that showed the picture of the crash of the ship that would taken 33 years previous. Slide, please. And the 3 bodies were brought back to Stockholm and cremated, and then a big funeral was held. Slide. We don't know what killed them. People think maybe trichinosis. Other people have said maybe food poisoning from a seal that they carried along, maybe botulism. I think they probably just were exhausted and died of exposure after 3 months out on the ice. Slide, please. You can still see in Spitsbergen remnants of their camp. Tourists aren't allowed to go there now, but they're there. Slide, please. And you can find pieces of iron that they used to make hydrogen, so forth. Next slide, please. So let me take you 10 years forward now to an American, Walter Wellman. Again, nobody's reached the North Pole. And he had an airship that was built for him. Slide, please. Slide. That's Wellman. And of course, this is his book. Everybody's got a book. Slide, please. And there's his airship. And that was built. And he tried to get toward the North Pole and get this airship to work in 1906. It failed. 1907 failed. Next slide, please. And the airship had a motor in it, steel car with a motor in it. And in 1909 was his last attempt. The airship and the whole expedition was funded by a newspaper from Chicago. Cost a lot of money. Slide, please. There's the final picture of the airship. Slide, please. The Chicago Record-Herald spent a lot of money. They wanted to be the first to document people getting to the North Pole. Nobody had reached the North Pole yet. Slide. Here's the ship coming out of the airship coming out of the hangar in 1909 for its last trip. Next slide. And the airship went only 42 miles. The motor failed. It then crashed. They were rescued by a ship that followed them. And that was the last attempt to reach the North Pole, 1909. Now, the next year, let me tell you about Zeppelins. You've heard of Zeppelins. Everybody's heard of Zeppelins. Well, what does that come from? It's from a man, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, a German. He had been working on airships from the late 1890s. And by 1910, he had a pretty good airship. And he flew it from Germany up to Spitsbergen and back to Germany. He didn't try to go to the North Pole, though. But the airship did work. And And what he did is publish this beautiful book, Mit Zeppelin nach Spitzbergen. It's the pictures from the expedition of the German airship, the German Zeppelin expedition. So, and what I'm going to show you are these beautiful pictures. These are the first color pictures taken of Spitzbergen, and they're just gorgeous. Slide. Slide. Look at these color pictures. Color pictures in 1910 was a big deal. Next slide. Thank you. And to finish, let me take you 5 years ahead. Now, Zeppelin kept making airships in Germany, and those ships were then used on what were called the Zeppelin raids on Great Britain. During World War I, there were 51 raids. 5,000 bombs were dropped from these Zeppelins. It was a horrible thing. Killed 557 British citizens, 1,300 were injured, and the British called these things baby killers, and they did mobilize the British opinion against Germany in the early part of World War I. Thank you. So I'm going to now give this over to Mark. Mark Piesing is a wonderful, he's an explorer, and he's a journalist. He's a journalist in Great Britain. He's written some remarkable things, award-winning things that you wouldn't think about, like recovering the last Nazi helicopter in 1945, painting it with Allied paint, and then flying it, the first helicopter flight across the English Channel, 1945. Wrote a paper on that. He's put drones inside nuclear reactors. He's wrote a story about the deepest hole ever dug by the Russians to reach the mantle of the earth. Amazing. Mark lives, he's just published his new book. He's going to tell us about his book. He lives in Oxford with his wife, his children, and his dog. Mark Piesing. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. That's a fantastic introduction. Just wait for Kevin to put the slides up. Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Marty. That was a brilliant talk and a fantastic introduction. It's a real privilege to be able to follow you talking about kind of airships to the North Pole, and obviously to plug my book fairly shamelessly. So my book N-4 Down: The Hunt for the Arctic Airship Italia is out on the 31st of August. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. And it's brilliant that the Explorers Club has given me the opportunity to do this. It's a real privilege to be here, even if it's virtually. It's a fantastically famous club, so it's brilliant to be a part of it. Slide, brilliant. Okay, so if I'm going to do a little bit more promotion of my book, I just wanted to flag this up. We had a really good week last week, an awesome week for someone who's just written their first book. The Wall Street Journal published a review of the book, a really good review of the book, and then in the email newsletter, they chose N-4 Down as one of the non-fiction true page turners, which is a fantastic way to end the week as well, and I couldn't hope for more. So in the book, what really starts me on this quest to find out about the crash of the airship Italia and the greatest kind of Arctic search and rescue operation is this book. I didn't really know much about Umberto Nobile and Italia until I got this, picked up the secondhand book. This book is about 94 years old, I think 92 years old, which is quite remarkable. And when I picked it up, it was written by him, Nobile, in about 1930, just after the events we're talking about, which is like 1926, 1928. So it's really kind of his reaction at that moment. And out of it dropped this newspaper cutting, which was from 1928, so even older, which is kind of, yet it looks so contemporary. I really needed to find out more, really. Next slide, please. And also this map folded out. And I don't know whether you're into your Philip Pullman and his Dark Materials, but I love that show. My kids do as well. And here we go. We've got Spitsbergen, as Marty was talking about, and the routes that Nobile flew to the east. We'll talk about that a little later. but I just needed to go there, a bit like Marty. You have to go to Svalbard. Next slide. So whereas the aeronauts flew there in a balloon or in an airship or in a plane or by ship, at least I got to fly there in a Boeing, which was much more pleasurable. And next slide. And then wasn't my exploration can't really compare to the people at this club have done, but I just wanted. But what it did strike me. So this is view down to Longyearbyen, the capital of Svalbard, if I've got that right. And I just realized being there, I had to write the story. And one of the key characters in the story has to be this amazing archipelago, as Marty said. It's just kind of really puts you in your place as a human to see these huge mountains and the ice and the snow. Brilliant slide. Okay, so here's the first character I'm going to introduce you. So Svalbard is kind of non-human character. Roald Amundsen is obviously a human character. He's the kind of classic kind of polar explorer, tough, blood, sweat, tears, muscle. He's not a nice guy, and I don't mean that. I don't mean that as a criticism. To achieve what he achieved, remember he achieved more in one lifetime than probably most of us would achieve in multiple lifetimes if we were given the chance. The first person to the Northwest Passage, the South Pole. But in order to achieve that, he was incredibly competitive, ruthless, probably. His nickname was the Chief. That gives you a clue to his kind of management style. I don't think I'd quite like to be managed by him, but he wouldn't accept any dissent. His way was the only way, and for a very practical reason, he felt was that's the only way to survive in these extreme conditions. You had to follow a leader, and that was the only thing about it, really. But he was also innovative. I think that's what people often forget about Amundsen, is that he was a kind of a very innovative person. He was one of the first people to realize the potential for aviation to kind of revolutionize exploration. But what he perhaps didn't realize was that it would also replace the traditional explorers like him with someone quite different, with the aeronaut, if you like. And I mean, his life was hard. He spent most of his life at the extremes of the world, and when he wasn't there, he actually spent it in a luxury hotel. So it's kind of quite a nice kind of balance in his life. But it was a hard life for him. Okay, next slide, please. So if you cut to 1924, Amundsen have tried to fly to the North Pole a couple of times, but by 1924 he was bankrupt. He was holed up in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. I think it's been remodeled and rebuilt since then. He was in his room. Creditors were knocking at the door, shoving bills underneath, knowing he was in there, and also wondering how the hell couldn't he pay us if he can afford these hotel bills. Well, he was kind of bankrupt. He'd run out of money numbers of times, but he always seemed to be able to afford a nice hotel. He probably wouldn't have said he was depressed. We would call it depression now. And then at his kind of nadir, at his lowest point, the phone rings, and in reception is this guy. Next slide, please. Richard Ellsworth, Lincoln Ellsworth. Not the average American. He's the son of a millionaire industrialist. He really wanted to explore discover his masculinity. He'd abandoned the soft life of New York plenty of times, gone out to work as a railway engineer. He was fascinated by Amundsen, people like Amundsen and Wyatt Earp as well. I mean, the gunfight at the OK Corral was only a few years ago, and Wyatt Earp was still alive here, and he was fascinated by these characters. And later on in his life, he wore a Wyatt Earp's wedding ring, apparently, as for good luck. So he was willing to bankroll Amundsen, or rather his father was, and that means that Amundsen could get on and try again to fly to the North Pole, and even perhaps beyond to Alaska. The next slide, please. Now, I really won't go into this much because Marty did such a brilliant job at explaining where Spitsbergen and Svalbard is. So we won't really repeat that. But other than that, he was going there to Kings Bay to launch his expedition. It was never really quite clear whether he was just going to go to the North Pole, or if all went well, he'd go to Alaska. Amundsen liked to be a slight man of mystery and keep his plans to himself, which wasn't always a good thing. Next slide. And one of the things about trying to fly off, fly from Svalbard to the North Pole and onwards, is how do you get your aircraft or later your airship to Svalbard? In 1925, most planes probably couldn't reach Svalbard from the mainland, and even if it could, it probably wasn't a very safe trip to do. So what Amundsen did was have Amundsen and Ellsworth had their planes dismantled, shipped usually on quite a small little ship like a whaler or fishing ship to Kings Bay, unloaded, and they had to rebuild them on the ice. Luckily at Kings Bay there was a mine, so there's lots of coal miners who wanted something interesting to do, and this is part of the wing of one of their flying boats. So they chose what's called the Dornier Whale, which was a kind of state-of-the-art flying boat, which is designed to operate in Arctic conditions. So you had a really tough hull, so you could land on ice or land in water between ice without too much fear you're going to get sunk. Didn't have pontoons that could be ripped off. So it's a very good aircraft to operate in this environment. Next slide. So here we go. So there's two of them, one with Ellsworth on board, one with Amundsen on board. And in May 1925, they kind of tobogganed across the ice, the frozen sea ice, just outside of Kings Bay, and headed north to the North Pole. Next slide, please. They obviously ran into some problems. They were still about 150 miles away from the North Pole, and they started to run out of fuel. Then Amundsen's plane as well, they started to have an engine problem, so he had to land very quickly. Ellsworth followed suit. Now Amundsen got down safely. Ellsworth, as they were landing, discovered that this kind of tobogganing across the ice at Kings Bay had kind of given them a leak, and then they had quite a rough landing, hit some ice, and their plane was pretty much with a write-off. They then had to spend 3.5 weeks, which is unbelievable. That unbelievable. These guys, I suppose bravery, almost foolhardiness. 3.5 weeks trying to build a runway for themselves so they could fly out. They put everything together to one aircraft, salvage the fuel, and this was their only hope. 3.5 weeks to build this runway. Ellsworth, who loves these kind of challenges, even he was ground down. I think the great quote was, "In the utter silence, this seemed to me to be the kingdom of death," because the only other option they had was, as Marty said, Andrée attempted, was to walk out of it. And some of these explorers really relished a chance to walk out, almost like they were going to the shops. Whereas reality, walking out across the sea ice is a perilous business, and quite often people did end up on their hands and knees trying to work out where the weakness in the ice was. And I think Ellsworth admitted in his account of this that this has basically meant their death. They realized if they couldn't fly out, they were probably going to die. But there's another problem for them. Next slide, please. No one actually knows what's happened to them. I said before, Amundsen quite likes to keep his cards close to his chest. But in that way, he kind of outfoxes people like Scott in Antarctica, but it has a downside to somewhere like this. No one actually knows where you're going. Are they going to the North Pole? Were they going to beyond to Alaska? Are they going to walk out? Have they actually had an accident? There's no radio. They're beyond kind of rescue at this point. So no one knows what's happening to them. And in America, because Amundsen was very much at home in America, so I suppose if you want to see it as a business, hero business, America was his main market. There's increasing demands for the Americans to do something. President Coolidge kind of clearly favors doing something, but he's also well aware that this is Amundsen's kind of signature move. I mean, to disappear. I mean, if you want to be cynical, it's quite good for sales. But when I made a mistake of Googling Amundsen missing in the New York Times archive, and there's over 100 examples of it. So it's something that was a regular occurrence. So he's a bit reticent about doing anything about it. But there's a brilliant quote from the New York Times journalist who's saying that the American Navy is keen to deploy one of their huge airships to go up to either the 2 routes they talked about was either up to Greenland, create a base in Greenland, and then explore from there, or to go to England and then up to Svalbard. The great quote was, practically every officer connected with the aeronautical service of the Navy will volunteer in the event that a call for help is made on behalf of Amundsen. So there's a real sense of daring do there and willingness to save the Norwegian. Next slide, please. So here you go. So this is the plane they're going to use. They put all the fuel together, all the food, everything's on board there, and they have to take off. They've got about 7 chances to take off, and after that point, that's it. They're going to have to face walking out and probably their own demise. 6 attempts and they can't take off. They don't make it. They've got one last chance, and they do. Riesel Larsen, who's Amundsen's right-hand man, is an expert pilot, and he gets them off at the 7th attempt. Ellsworth writes, "Men fight for their lives to the last inch," and they clearly did. They just get enough fuel to get back to near Svalbard. They land in the sea. They're saved by a kind of a whaler. When the captain sees Amundsen, he says, "You're supposed to be dead." And this kind of adds to the kind of Amundsen mythology that he's almost impossible to die, which also makes it quite hard to know when to rescue him, because he's always going to survive. Is a kind of ethos. He'll be all right in the end. But it kind of adds to the legend. And they get back to Oslo, surprisingly, as heroes. The next slide, please. I went on a bit too long there. So back in Spitsbergen, planes landed 150 miles from the pole, shortage of fuel, force returned. What is interesting is something I'm going to talk about now is why were these people up there? What were they possibly wanting to achieve? Expedition cited no land in the far north. And if you look on the map, there's a grey area, and that is unexplored. And it seems incredible now that people believe this, but lots of people believe there was an undiscovered continent or undiscovered land there, which they wanted to claim perhaps for their own country. If you move on, next slide, please. So mass attack on polar regions begins March 1926. Amundsen came away from the North Pole hero, even though he hadn't achieved any of his goals, but he was determined to go back again. This is what we mean by this obsession about the North Pole. And having only been to Svalbard, for a short time, I desperately want to go back. There's something about that place. I'm sure Marty feels the same. You just want to go back. This draws you, perhaps to our doom. And Amundsen very quickly decides he wants to go back in an airship. He'd already thought about it before this flight, and he certainly wants to do it now, because the airship gives you a number of things when it comes to Arctic exploration. It gives you range. You can go much farther. You can go much farther than a fixed-wing aircraft at the time, and also, in theory, gives you a stable platform, so you can do your navigation properly. You can keep your records. And remember, the problem on the North Pole is it's on sea ice. It's not a fixed point. So to prove that you've got there, you really need to have really good navigational records, and it allows you to kind of do your scientific research, which is often a justification for many of these flights as well. So he wants to go back in the airship, but he's aware now there's lots of competition. Lots of other people want to fly to the North Pole and beyond to Alaska before him. The sense of, as well as kind of patriotism, colonialism, if you want to use that kind of word, of wanting to claim this land, this unknown land for their own countries. Amundsen got into a bit of a pickle in America on his promotional tour to raise money and raise a kind of awareness of his trip. He seemed to promise any land that he found simultaneously to the Americans and the Norwegians, which almost caused an international incident between them. Now, in 1925, if you wanted to buy an airship, there's probably 2 people you'd go to buy one from. Next slide, please. Okay, the first one is Italian Umberto Nobile. He's kind of faded from history now. He was a brilliant young Italian engineer and pilot. He was in charge of the kind of Italian military airship factory. He kind of mass-produced airships, or nearly mass-produced them. He sold them to countries like kind of Spain and Britain and America, and later to Japan and even kind of Russia. He was very charismatic. He was young. He was everything Amundsen wasn't, in a way. He was young. He had a wife and child. He'd lived in southern Italy, a luxurious life, not the hard extremes of the earth. He was a pilot, an aeronaut. and so he was extreme opposite, but he had an airship, and he had an airship ready for Amundsen to buy and Ellsworth to buy. They'd actually scoped it out in 1924, and Amundsen probably met Nobile, certainly met Mussolini at the time. So there's Nobile, and then there's one other person. Next slide, please. Well, actually, I forgot. Yes, the thing about Nobile and Amundsen hadn't really appreciated was that he comes with baggage, and the baggage is the people who run his country. You've got Mussolini in the center, the dictator of Italy, and then to his right you have Italia Balbo, one of the other founders of the Italian Fascist Party. These are tough guys. Again, not particularly very nice. In 1922, they led the march on Rome, where I can't remember the numbers of the followers, maybe 10,000 marched on Rome. The king had a choice: does he deploy the army against these guys, or does he give in to the demands for them to form a government? He gives in, and democracy in Italy dies, and you get into now the kind of the fascist period. So they're pretty ruthless. They want to use Nobile's airship and any deal with Amundsen as a way to promote their regime. The fascists love aviation, and this will be the ship that they would use. Nobile's kind of prototype airship N-1, which is later renamed the Norge. For 100,000, it'll be Ellsworth's and Amundsen's. $100,000 below the price it costs Italians to make. So it should have been a little bit of a warning to Amundsen about what their true intentions. There's one other person. Next slide, please. Hugo Echner. Now, Marty talked about Count Zeppelin and the Blitz. Echner succeeded Zeppelin. He used to be a journalist, and the story has it that he wrote a critical article about Count Zeppelin. And one day there was a knock on the door, and there was Count Zeppelin, and persuaded him to come and see for himself. And he kind of, like many engineers and entrepreneurs, I've written a few articles about airships. It seems to suck people in. I'm not sure what the magic or the romance, something about it seems to suck people in, and he was sucked in about it. He was sucked in to this world. And after the First World War, he found himself very quickly in a battle to keep the business going. As Marty said, the London Blitz, and then similar actions in cities over Europe as well by the German Zeppelins, meant no one after the war wanted to see a German Zeppelin in the sky. It was a real symbol for German nationalism. Part of the Treaty of Versailles was he couldn't build any more Zeppelins, very large Zeppelins. So he had a problem trying to keep his company going, and he needed Amundsen. Really to agree to his plan to build an airship, because that meant he probably could get the Allied powers to let him build an airship for a peaceful purpose, like the exploration of the Arctic. He was chasing Amundsen probably more than Amundsen was chasing him. If you look at the New York Times, there's a wonderful series of reports of their kind of wooing each other, but in the end, it's probably a foregone conclusion that he was going to go with Nobile. But there's one thing that Echner did have over Nobile. Can you go to the next slide? Is this? He had been allowed to build one other really big airship since the First World War. This is the airship that would become the Los Angeles, the USS Los Angeles. It's for part of the reparations payment to America for the war. And he flew it personally over the Atlantic in a massive demonstration of the potential of the airship. It's designed to be a passenger kind of carrying aircraft. It had to be in terms of the Treaty of Versailles, even though it was going to be given to the Navy. And here it is over New York. So he has achieved this remarkable thing, but now he has to try and get the support, get the money to build another airship, whereas Nobile has a much smaller airship, but it's already there and operational. And the two men don't really get on either. So there's this kind of friction between them. Brilliant. Next slide. So this is Svalbard, and Marty talked brilliantly about Svalbard. So this is Svalbard, and the key thing about it is industrial. It's about coal, and if you read the book, we talk a little about the importance of mining, coal mining, in terms of the kind of the ownership of Svalbard. But the key thing what we're talking about here is this hangar. So if you're going to fly an airship up to the Arctic, which they're going to have to do because airships now are far more complicated than the Wellman's airship. You couldn't dismantle it. You had to fly it all the way up. You needed a hanger at the other end, because if you just tied it to a mast, it would just be torn to pieces. So the Italians, remarkably, the steel was signed in. Amundsen came back from his expedition in June 1925. By September, he had signed a deal with the Italians. By October, before the winter came in, remember the race to the North Pole was going on. By October, the Italian engineers had made it up to Svalbard to build this wooden hangar before winter sets in, and they work throughout winter. So winter, obviously, in the Arctic is pitch black, 24 hours a day darkness, and they work through this. And by the spring, there's a hangar waiting for Nobile's airship. Next slide. Okay, if you want to play this, if it will work. So yeah, so they, to get to Svalbard, they have to fly. They go a circuitous route via Pullen in Norfolk, UK, Oslo, Leningrad, and up to Svalbard. We'll just watch a little bit of this clip, but it shows you the idea of the media hustle as well. They all want exclusives. They all want content, much like we did in the internet 10 years ago. Content is king. Same was here. So this is the Norge flying over the beautiful English countryside on the way to Norfolk in April 1925. From the Pathé News, Pathé News kind of camera crew on the biplane. Can you scroll it forward a bit, Kevin? I know it's a bit tricky. Oh, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Can you, just a few minutes if we can get through, yeah. So there's some more footage as well. So, brilliant, thank you. Next slide. So somewhere in there, you had a nice picture of Umberto Nobile and the numbers of people it took. To haul one of these aircraft in, because the thing at Pullen, they had these massive hangars. As I said, it was like the Cape Canaveral of the day. Lots of technological aviation experimentation in air traffic control, but they had these hangars and they could put the airship in there and it was safe before flying on. Brilliant, and it took a lot of people, and there's a nice clip of him there as well. So eventually get up to Svalbard, and what they find is they're not alone. We talked about this mass attack on the North Pole, and here you've got Richard Byrd. Richard Byrd, was a kind of the ideal kind of American hero. He's good looking. He was young. He was ambitious. He was a ruthless competitor. He understood how to use the media probably better than Amundsen did. He had some credible financial backers in Ford, I think Rockefeller as well. So he had lots of money. Now Ellsworth was paying for the Norge, but it's still quite bootstrapped as an operation. Whereas Byrd had a lot of money to spend. He came up with a lot of support as well. No one expected him to be there. And there was a bit of argy-bargy, a bit of a kind of underhand doings between his men and the Norwegians. There was a good example was there's one quayside really at Kings Bay. There was a Norwegian ship there. His ship wanted to dock to unload their aircraft, and he actually brought 2 aircraft with him. The Norwegians wouldn't move, and Baird blamed Amundsen's dirty tricks, because obviously Amundsen has a reputation of being a fearsome competitor. So instead, Byrd has to build pontoons, lower the aircraft in bits onto the pontoons, and kind of punt them across to the ice. So there's a real sense of kind of rivalry between the two crews, if not between the two men. Amundsen declared his innocence. Byrd was never too sure, and then Balkan, who's one of Amundsen's men, helped them as well. So there's kind of odd things going on there. And then in the middle of the night, in early May, they take off to fly to the North Pole, get there and come back too early, about a couple of hours too early, and lots of people started to whisper, did they really get to the North Pole? Because that would have required quite a high speed for a plane like the Fokker. And so whispers already started that perhaps he didn't make it to the North Pole. And this would become more of an issue for Byrd later on. And this would kind of haunt his career, really. Next slide. So Nobile, in May, then Nobile Ellsworth and Amundsen set off in the Norge, first stop the North Pole, and then onwards through this unexplored area, which is great on the map, to Alaska. It's an incredible journey, and with lots of kind of controversy along the way. And if you get to the next slide, when one of these incidents occurs at the North Pole, there's already tension between, between the men. Amundsen wanted Nobile to be kind of like a hired help, a hired pilot. Nobile, as we said, with Mussolini and Italia Balbo breathing down his neck, had no intention of being that. And he'd already renegotiated aspects of the contract, which Amundsen didn't like. Most importantly of all, it meant that it was now the Amundsen, Ellsworth, Nobile expedition. And then at North Pole, there's more trickery as far as Amundsen was concerned. Ellsworth and Amundsen get out these quite small flags, drop them over the North Pole to commemorate their being there, and also to act as kind of proof that they'd been there. Meanwhile, the Italians unroll this massive flag and drop it out of the window as well. Amundsen sees it as a joke, doesn't, but secretly he quite resents this because nobody had all the time been going on at the Norwegians about how careful they have to be about the weight of the airship. But all the time, the Italians had smuggled this flag aboard. That's very much from Amundsen's perspective. Brilliant. Carry on. So let's have a little clip of this video. So this is where they got to the end. They've arrived in Alaska, in Nome, but they kind of landed in Teller, a bit kind of further towards the North Pole. And here are the men. See the kind of warm clothes they have to wear to try and stay warm. I'm not sure it succeeded. Amundsen aged quite a lot after his recent adventures, and then here we go. Hopefully it'll come next. Yeah, so the end to proud ship. The only problem, the good advantage of an airship is you can land anywhere. The only problem is that you really need an airship mask and about 200 people when you land in order to keep your airship on the ground. Now, if they got through to Nome, there was an airship mask and there was a ground crew organized, but they landed short in Teller. That meant when they landed, they basically had to jump out very quickly and deflate the envelope before it floated off again. So the proud airship ended up a crumpled heap on the floor. If you go to the next picture, please. Yeah, so it ended up a crumpled heap on the floor. It never made it back to Italy, and there are bits and souvenirs all over Alaska from it. And what I wanted to give you here, if you go through the next two slides as well, it's just a sign of how big this story was. And again, brilliant. So three full pages in New York Times, just hold it there. 3 full pages in the New York Times devoted to the story. A story that most people have totally forgotten about now, which is quite remarkable. Yet at the time, it was seen as one of the amazing achievements of the age. And then there's this graphic on the last page, which I love. I suppose now we've got an infographic, but what I love is it hints at the conflict between the men, Amundsen and Ellsworth in one hand and Nobile in the other. We talked about these tensions have been building up. Well, they really kind of exploded after they got back to Alaska. It was an amazingly successful trip, but the tension between the men couldn't be contained. Amundsen had really hadn't understood the change in the age. No one really wanted to talk to the kind of old-time explorers. Everyone wanted to talk to the aeronauts, the young kind of handsome Italian guy, Umberto Nobile, who designed and flew the aircraft. He was very much seen to be the hero, not Amundsen. Also, he was being pushed by Mussolini, to be fair to him as well. And there's a huge problem that Amundsen faced. There were Norwegians living, obviously in America. There were Norwegian migrants to America, but there were a lot more Italians. And the Italians had organized around the Fascist League of North America, which was kind of pro-Mussolini. They mobilized a lot of American public opinion. So really nobody gained most of the credit for the trip rather than Amundsen. Amundsen, this was supposed to be his last big thing, really retired, kind of fairly bitter about what had happened. And it was Nobile who was called the New Columbus. I know that's problematic these days as a term, but at the time, I suppose it wasn't the way it was used. It was known as the New Columbus. and it was not Amundsen who was called out as Nobile. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is one of the kind of thing that inflamed Amundsen. This is a Nobile on the steps, I think, of New York City Hall, next to George Walker. Is it George or James John Walker, who was mayor at the time, very corrupt individual by all accounts. And so this is kind of the claim that Nobile was getting, and not Amundsen really. But there's a darker side to this. We talked about the Fascist League of North America. But the night before, when he arrived in New York at Grand Central Station, over 400 Italian black shirts turned out in a full uniform to kind of celebrate, to cheer, to riot slightly as well. The police almost lost control. So there's quite a dark side to what was going on here as well. And the appearance of black shirts in New York, should have been in Man in the High Castle, if you ever saw that show on Amazon. Brilliant. Next slide, please. So Balbo again. So this is very much how Italia Balbo would like to see himself, with a kind of signature in the corner, the Hollywood film star, the aeronaut himself. Nobile had done very well out of the trip. He'd become a general, he'd become a member of the fascist party to help trying to keep him safe perhaps from some of his enemies. He'd met the president. He had a huge reputation now. It was also made you even more of a target in fascist Italy. He wanted to go back to the North Pole. Like Amundsen, he'd fallen in love with the North Pole. I guess as well, he had all the celebrity and the worship he got from going to the North Pole compared to the backfighting and knife, that you had in fascist Italy. So you can see why he wanted to. He was designing an even bigger airship to go back. He wasn't happy with the N-1. He wanted an airship more like the German Zeppelins when they were building one. And then he made one fatal mistake. He went to Japan. The Japanese had bought one of his airships. He went to Japan to teach them how to construct it, how to fly it. Also, he got more adulation and screaming crowds when he was there. But when he was there, he learned that Italia Balbo had become the head of the Air Force, in effect, chucking out one of the allies of Nobile. And then one of the first things he did was destroy Nobile's airship, which is almost complete. He even melted down the parts. So when Nobile came back, there's no chance at all that the airship could be reused or rebuilt. Next slide, please. Nobile then did a very silly thing when he got back. He didn't go and see Balbo. He was so angry. And he kind of almost was setting himself up to challenge him. And there's one thing you don't do is challenge a street fighter like like Balbo, in part because of his close relationship with Mussolini. I love this picture. So this is Mussolini giving Italia Balbo his flying license, and the relationship between them. I mean, Mussolini's almost blushing. It's a really lovely relationship between two very problematic figures, very evil almost. But it is a sign of their relationship, and Nobile quickly found himself really pushed out into the cold. So he went to see Mussolini. He used to see Mussolini by himself. He went to see Mussolini. Can he go back to the North Pole? Mussolini was there now with Balbo, and this would be the last time he saw Mussolini until the summer of 1928. And very famously, Mussolini was very reluctant to give him permission. And the good quote was, "Perhaps it would be better not to tempt fate a second time by returning to the North Pole." And weirdly, there's something that a Japanese lady said to him in Japan as well, when he was talking about his plans. But he persuades Mussolini to let him go. Apparently, after he left the room, Balbo is alleged to have said to Nobile, "Let him go, for he cannot possibly come back to bother us anymore," which is quite a damning statement of what Balbo intended. Whether he did sabotage Nobile's expedition is open for debate. Nobile and his supporters certainly think he did. And there were certainly times when Nobile asked for seaplanes to accompany them to Svalbard, but Balbo turned them down. So there's some things which were clearly quite dodgy, but on the other hand, he did actually let them raise money. The government wasn't going to put any money in, but he could raise money through the Royal Geographic Society of Italy and the City of Milan, and also selling media rights as well, which are worth a fair bobble too. And you got a bonus if you landed on the North Pole, and even more money if they appeared to go missing for a couple of days and then reappeared. Next slide. This time he wasn't going to kind of go this circular route around Europe. He's going to go almost straight to Svalbard. There's one stopping off place in Stolp, which was a Zeppelin base in Germany. It's now in Poland, and there was still a hangar there from the war. It had been preserved because after the war they thought that east-west, north-south Zeppelin routes, airship routes, passenger airship routes would cross there, and it would be a big kind of interchange for commercial airship travel, which obviously didn't happen. But this is how serious people took the prospect. They flew over the mountains of Central Europe. They had a really tough time. The airship got really battered. Just remember, it's a small airship, really loaded down with too much weight. The tail got damaged. The propellers got worn down by the hail. The men were exhausted, and they landed in Stolp in the early hours of the morning. And then they had to use these German soldiers to keep the airship on the ground and pull it into the hangar. Nobile also ended in a controversy as well. German nationalists, who obviously this is now 1928, which nationalism was on the rise, like in Italy, blamed him for the disarmament of Germany. The rumor spread around very quickly that he was on one of the disarmament committees that broke up the Zeppelins and the Zeppelin hangars and the Zeppelin kind of industry. And they said he was mad to come back to Germany. This is also reported as fact in the New York Times, but actually was untrue. He was not on the disarmament committee at all. And then, indeed, he wanted Germany to have an industry, because the more airship industries there were, the more liable his one would succeed. And then he unfortunately had to ask Italy, send to Italy for mechanics and spare parts, all the time knowing that he could be cancelled, he could be withdrawn. He didn't go back to Italy to repair the airship as well, because he might not ever leave again. And also on the other side is that May is a good flying weather in the Arctic. He was running out of time to get to Svalbard to do his flights. The airship was finally repaired. And then he had terrible wind as well, that kept him kind of almost imprisoned in Stolp for far too long into early May. And what was worse was when he was there, Hubert Wilkins, who was became a famous American Australian explorer, completed a flight from Alaska to Svalbard, kind of wrong direction, along the similar route that the Norse took. We looked at the map, and his flight was acclaimed as one of the great triumphs of aviation. I mean, he wasn't non-stop; he had to land because of bad weather, and this kind of highlighted his impotence. And even the New York Times started to argue that perhaps nobody had left it too late. He wasn't going to make the North Pole. So the pressure was really building on him. Let's go to the next slide, please. We're running out of time a bit. So had to go over Sweden on the way there. Next slide. And just a few minutes of this newsreel. This is not Italia landing after the trip across Europe. Nobody wanted to do at least 5 trips. The first trip wasn't successful because of bad weather to the east, to the coast of Siberia. So he had to come back. And this is Italia coming back from that flight. So you get a sense of the majesty of the ship, and the Svalbard mountains, which look beautiful, but behind the beauty is obviously death, which is a great quote some other journalist wrote. I wish I'd written that. So it's like coming in over Kings Bay as well. And all the men who's needed to all the miners, a lot of people to bring it down into airship mast. I just wanted to show this because it's a good example of how it works. And that's one of the classic pictures you see now, of the Italia docking at the mast. Brilliant. And then you can just, if you're interested in the mechanism, it's not often you see this bit. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? Brilliant. So they do another flight over to the east, right to the coast of Siberia. The number of archipelagos there, Franz Joseph Land, and one that used to be called Nicholas II Land before the revolution, which the coastline was known about. There wasn't much known about the interior. and there were other rumors of other lands being out there. And this was a really successful trip. I think it covered about 2,200 miles. So this is longer than the flight of the Norge. This was without any Norwegian help. It took 69 hours. And what was even more remarkable is this about May 15th, they came back to exactly the same spot. Now, somebody asked me in the podcast the other day, why is it always one way in these early days? Well, that's because navigation was so tricky. So the fact that they were able to leave from Kings Bay and come back to Kings Bay was a triumph, using radio direction finding, which is kind of a new radical technology. And here you can see the Italia coming in after their 2,200-mile flight, and you've got the hangar there. And presumably this is the Città di Milan, the kind of the base ship, cheering them in. Unfortunately, and here's Nobile's achievement was recognized by the Norwegian journalists, who are normally very skeptical about the Italians, but it's totally lost in what happens next. Next slide. So this is allegedly the last picture taken of Nobile before he set off for the North Pole, which is ironically one of the shortest journeys he wanted to do. And there's kind of an element of pathos to it, whether that's because we know what happens next, or whether that there was kind of some premonition about what was going to happen next. But it's quite a remarkable picture. So in the morning of May 23rd, they set off. Next slide, please. They get to the North Pole without a hitch. You can see it doesn't get quite so much media coverage, and the journalists were covering it, that nothing was happening. They were getting pressure from the editors to come up with some story, because actually nothing was happening. And what was happening, Nobile was keeping to himself because of his own media deal with other newspapers. Again, this is the idea of the exclusive. He has to keep the exclusive. So it's a good that he's made it to the North Pole. To get a bonus for his, in addition to his, I think it was $20,000, to get a bonus on top of that, he had to land on the North Pole. That meant being winched down onto the North Pole itself to plant the flag, if you like. But the wind was too strong to allow that to happen. He also had a plan originally to land some scientists on the North Pole. That was his dream, to have a kind of a base at the North Pole. But luckily enough for the scientists, he never got that far. Even though nobody had been warned that to land some people at the North Pole, leave them, come back in a few weeks' time would meant certain death for them, because it's very hard to find the people again in the sea ice. They basically would have been left, suffered a terrible fate. So not as much publicity as last time, but still, front page of the papers. Next slide, please. So obviously, about 2 days later, about a day later after they leave the North Pole, actually less than that, it's about kind of 8 hours, they crash. Actually more than, yeah, it's about a day, just under a day. They crash on the sea ice near Svalbard. But it didn't have to happen like this. Nobody had choices. He could have gone on to Canada, a bit like the Norge, and land, and then the fate of the Italia would have been the same. There was no airship masts, no land crew. They would have had to deflate it straight away. He could have gone around in the big circle where the weather was better, further north, where there was a wind pushing them, but it would have taken much longer to get back to Kings Bay for an exhausted crew. That would perhaps have been tough. Instead, he chose to go back to Kings Bay under the advice of his navigator, and weatherman Finn Malmgren. Now they knew they'd be flying into the wind, but had been told that this wind would die pretty quickly, and this is the route they chose. With certain misgiving on Nobile's part, whether it's kind of looking back on it with regrets, but he did have some misgiving about this route, but he trusted his navigator, and they ended up in problems. The wind didn't die away, and the airship crashed on the ice. Well, to say it crashed is slightly misleading, because if you notice, it's the tail that crashes and the gondola that gets destroyed. The airship itself survives, but without any form of power or guidance. And the terrible thing that happened was, out of the 16 men, the airship floated off with 6 of the men still on board. These men were never seen again, nor was the airship. Nobody writes of looking up at seeing the men staring down through the hole in the ship. So Nobile and and 9 other men were left on the ice. What they rapidly discovered was that another man had died as well. He was sitting upright when they found him. He looked like he was alive, but he had died almost of concussion and bruising. Next slide, please. Now, no one really knows why the airship crashed. At the time, there's lots of stories about the loss of hydrogen. The airship had gone up quite high to get out of the storm. That meant they had to release hydrogen because it was expanding in the sun. But the danger was when you went back into the kind of freezing cold cloud, you suddenly would lose all that lifting power and you could plummet quite easily. In this case, it was a tail that hit, so perhaps there was actually a leak in the tail through one of the valves that they had to use to release hydrogen from. Perhaps it was ice. The dirigibles have a huge surface area, and if and ice can form very easily on them. Nobile had covered the top to try and protect it, but perhaps ice had formed, and now more and more the focus has been on human factors. He'd been in charge for 72 hours. We now know from airplane crashes how that impairs your judgment. He hadn't appointed a second in command. It's a real cult of the leader here. So there's no one to challenge his judgment if it was going wrong. If you could carry on to the next slide, please. This is Hollywood reimagined this as the Lost Zeppelin. You can watch it on YouTube. I wouldn't advise it. It hasn't aged very well. Set in the Antarctic, and nobody has been replaced by Richard Byrd. Character looks like Richard Byrd. Then very quickly move on, please. What they were able to do, this is another picture from a magazine, from a wonderful magazine, is reassemble the radio. It's a shortwave radio, which meant they could bizarrely, fantastically communicate over the world and hear the world talking about them. It's an invention of kind of technology developed by Marconi, famous Italian designer, engineer. But the problem is they were broadcasting quite quickly SOS messages, but they couldn't hear. No one could appear to be hearing them. No one replied. And all they could hear was about searches for the Italia in places where they weren't. It must have been terrible to hear that the search was being launched in the wrong place. So no one knew whether anyone was getting their message. 3 of the men grew tired of waiting and decided to walk out over the sea ice. We know how well that's going to fare by now. Nobody has been criticized for not forbidding them as a failure of leadership. I think his view was that if he had forbidden them, they would have just gone anyway. And any leadership he had left would have been destroyed by then. And you have to remember, nobody was seriously wounded in the crash as well. So he's not really in a good state to be leading the expedition anymore. So those 3 go. They rapidly find out the wind is blowing the sea ice faster backwards than they can move forwards, and they're getting further and further away from dry land. And one of them is never seen again. Only 2 are rescued at the end. The fate of the 3rd one. We'll talk about that in a minute if we have time. Very quickly move on. So very quickly, a search and rescue operation was launched. This is the largest search and rescue operation in Arctic history. In the end, they were 23 planes, 20 ships from Denmark, France, Italy, Norway, Soviet Union, Sweden, and United States, all thrown together in the search for Nobile. In terms of Brexit, I have to say here, as a British person, the British refused to be involved, even though the British Empire had the flying boats and the seaplane tenders, which would have made this task a lot easier, and perhaps the coordination skills. But the British, in true British fashion, refused to get involved in this continental affair. Next slide, please. Yeah, just try and watch a little bit of this. Can you skip forward a minute, please, as well? This is the Pathway News biplane, which they're always talking about for exclusive. They're fantastic, yeah. So this is one of the rescue planes arriving. This is Maddalena, Italian ace, who'd been sent by the government with some reluctance. The government, Balbo Mussolini, had their arms pulled by a very important Italian businessman to do something about Nobile. They were basically abandoning him. So they sent Maddalena and 2 other pilots, and this is a Savoia, which is one of the best aircraft sent to the Arctic. We forget how good some of the Italian aircraft designs were now, but this is one of the best ones they had. And here it has them landing back from the mission in Kings Bay. Fantastic aircraft, and you had a glimpse of Maddalena and Captain Romania. Here you go. So Maddalena's on the side, Captain Romania of the Citizen de Man is the base ship is on the right. Pardon my pronunciation. We're very pleased with themselves. They are too. Okay. And Romania has a very bad reputation in Nobile's eyes for being too slow to act, whether in cahoots with the government or because he was cautious. Is open to judgment. Thank you very much. You want to get to the next slide, please? In this expedition was Amundsen. Amundsen had done the heroic thing when he heard about Nobile's crash of offering to come and lead the expedition to rescue him. Mussolini hadn't forgotten Amundsen's antics in 1926 and refused to let him lead the expedition. He'd also become a very bitter man. Lots of people by now didn't want to have anything to do with Amundsen. The Norwegian government, for example, didn't really want to have anything to do with him. So he was forced to go it alone. He found some French backers, and this was a prototype French flying boat called the Latin II. So it's a quite high risky flight for him. The Latin I ended up having a fire and was a write-off. It didn't have a good reputation. The French pilots weren't keen to fly this. Amundsen quickly realized the engines weren't good enough. It had a wooden hull. It wasn't really designed to land in the ice. Unlike the Dornier whales, which he wanted to use, it had pontoons on either end, which could be ripped off as well. Not the ideal. So when he was talking about going to save Nobile, it would have been suicide for him to actually land it. So what was he trying to actually do? Anyway, he takes off in middle of June from Tromsø for the flight to Svalbard. At least he thinks he was going to Svalbard. Again, he keeps his routes to himself. No one really knew. He was seen by fishermen disappearing into a thick, huge cloud and was never seen again. Next slide. Some faint kind of radio messages were heard. Within about 3 days, they start sending out an expedition to find him. As you can see, Norway and France and other countries join in, diverts resources from Nobile's men, although they now know where Nobile's men is. What they haven't done is actually rescue them yet. So this diverts resources perhaps at a key time from getting his men off the ice. And they still can't find anything of Amundsen. Next slide, please. One of the first aircraft to actually get to the Red Tent, Nobile's camp, the camp of the survivors, had a film crew, had a film cameraman at the tail of the plane to film it, and they kind of circled around filming for one of the newsreels. Nobile talked about feeling violated by this because obviously he was in a disgusting state and he felt very depressed by this experience. Now, we don't know. There's lots of stories about this picture. Is this a still from that camera, from that film? Is it, as many people suspect, a fake photograph from a model they built back in America, trying to simulate what it looked like because they didn't have the exclusive footage? I'll leave that to make up your mind, but it does give an idea of what the encampment was like and the conditions they were living in. Next slide. This is a real picture of the encampment, and this is one of the scientists, Franz Bernuck. Pardon my pronunciation, it's terrible. And this is a debris of the crash. Nobile talked about recovering from his injuries, feeling a bit better, dragging himself out of his tent to only discover he's surrounded by the debris of his command. Everywhere on the ice was the wreckage of the kind of the cabin and the engines. Really depressing for the characters. And this gives a sense of the desperation and the conditions they were living in. Next slide. Now, they did when they found Nobile, they decided to try and rescue him. This guy called Lundberg was a very heroic figure, very brave figure. Had a kind of slightly murky past as a mercenary. He fought for the Kaiser's army. He fought with the White Russians. He fought with the kind of, I think it was the Latvians against the Reds. And he came back to Sweden, to his home country. He landed to rescue the men. And what was interesting was he insisted that Umberto Nobile, the cat, goes with him. He kind of cajoles him, threatens him, nags him, and against his better judgment, or perhaps, I mean, he was so ill, he's so badly injured, he's probably in no position to really make this judgment himself. Nobody agrees to go with him. Now, there's lots of theories about why this is. Obviously, the celebrity, this is a fantastic picture with Nobole's dog, which survives every kind of crash he's involved in. This is worth a fair sum of money to the newspapers. The celebrity of bringing Nobile back, it would be fantastic for Lundberg as well. And there's also other stories about Nobile took out quite a large sum of life insurance against his name. And there's one story is that the life insurance company hires Lundberg to go and get Nobile back so they don't have to pay the insurance. The other is Italia Balbo wants Nobile to come back to ruin his career. It could be all those stories, or it could be Lundberg thought he was doing the right thing at the time. Madeleine also days earlier thinks Nobile should come back to lead the expedition, so perhaps there's some confusion at whether an order was given or not. Anyway, he comes back. Next slide, please. He's rescued. So this is him coming onto the Sette de Milan, the kind of command ship. Lots of gossip went around that he was able to almost run up to the deck, but clearly he was in no position to at all. And soon he was going to find himself under effectively house arrest, unable to help in the rescue of his men, in the sense because that would vindicate his decision to leave. So his enemies were determined for that to happen. And Balbo and his enemies in Rome really threw him to the international press by releasing at least one press release that hinted at perhaps it wasn't quite straightforward reasons why he left the ice. Next picture. We're getting towards the end now. So it's brilliant. A bit over the time, but thank you for your patience. Here we have Lundberg. This is where it turns tragedy, well, victory in terms of rescuing them, turns into tragedy, turns into farce. Lundberg returns to rescue the rest of the men, overturns on the ice. And this is a picture of him and some of the other survivors and the wrecked aircraft. This also explains perhaps why aircraft didn't try more often trying to land. You know, these aircraft are very vulnerable. For pilots to show initiative like Lundberg did led to disaster. So you could understand perhaps there's a reluctance to land to save these guys. Next picture, please. So it was left to the Krasan, the mighty Soviet icebreaker, who was able to get within about 100 yards of the camp. A remarkable achievement that none of the aircraft, the high-tech aircraft, were able to do. On the way, they picked up, I know I talked about the 3 people who left at Nobile's camp. So after a month and a half about on the sea ice, they rescued them remarkably. Well, 2 of them, not the third person. Malgrim, the kind of was never seen again. The 2 survivors, one of them was emaciated on the verge of death, Mariano, and the third guy, Captain Zappi, looked surprisingly well nourished and had really nice clothes on from Malgrim and even his old clothes. And lots of stories very quickly started to go around about cannibalism. It was a time, if you Google cannibalism in this year, hundreds of stories about cannibalism. It was almost like an obsession. One great headline was Nobile aides accused of cannibalism on Icy Trek. Mystery about Malgrim's body gives rise to reports of cannibalism. Was that Swede really eaten by those Italians? Time magazine asked. So that story really came out of this mystery. What happened to this third person? Again, another mystery. He's never seen again. His body is never found. But remarkable achievement. Next slide. And here's a picture from the distance showing Lundberg's crash, showing the red tent and the kind of desolation. So these guys could crash at towards the end of May, and they were rescued almost about 2 months later. Spent all that time out in the open. Incredible hardship. It's incredible they survived in any shape at all. Next slide, please. So here you go. Here are the 8 sliders, 8 survivors. So 16 men went on Italia, 6 floated away, never to be seen again. 1 died in a crash. 1 disappeared, perhaps horribly eaten by his compatriots, the rule of the sea. And the rest went back to Italy. Rather like Lenin being sent back from Switzerland to Russia, Mussolini hired a sealed coach. Well, it wasn't quite sealed, but that's what the newspaper said, to bring them back. When they got back to Tromsø, Norwegians were in uproar because on that day, the Norwegian government had basically said were going to have to give up searching for Amundsen. So nobody was alive. Amundsen, the hero, was dead. Amundsen had gone to save Nobile, but Nobile was alive. That's wrong. So they were furious. They wouldn't let him set foot on Norwegian soil, so they had to walk down a long plank into the carriage. And then he headed back to Rome, not sure what he was going to find. The government was really against him. He got all the papers on his way down. He realized the kind of propaganda Balbo and Rome had been spinning against him. But when he got to Italy, he was a hero. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out to applaud him in the stations they stopped at. Mussolini and Balbo were popularists, so had to be with the people. So they backed away. He had a real opportunity to get something from this, but I suppose he was suffering from post-traumatic stress. He was furious at what had happened to him. He confronted Mussolini, had a stand-up fight with Mussolini, survived, refused to see Balbo, and found himself subject to a board of inquiry, which kind of convicted him of found him guilty for the crash of the airship. And his story goes on. Last slide, please. By August, they've given up trying to find Amundsen. Other rescue efforts continued, and the 6 Italians as well. So again, we can hope that global warming, the only positive thing about global warming and the melting ice, could be mysteries like this are finally solved. We haven't got time to watch the last video, but the pathos. Oh, can you go back? Well, we won't watch the last video, but the pathos is here. So 1931, that is a Graf Zeppelin. Hugo Echner had tried to get the Graf Zeppelin ready to help rescue Nobile, but it wasn't quite ready in time. That would have been an amazing thing to see, perhaps in a what if version of history. By 1931, he does what Nobile wanted to do. He takes a large airship to the Arctic, flies around the Arctic, conducting kind of scientific research in theory. At this key moment, they meet up with a Russian icebreaker. On board is Nobile. Echner refused to have Nobile on board on his airship flight because he didn't want to be taught how to crash into the ice. He was very dismissive of Nobile. On board is Ellsworth, and briefly Ellsworth and Nobile shake hands through the window of the airship before the Zeppelin has to go off again. Kind of full of pathos. Nobile apparently had aged terribly as a result of experience, but at least he demonstrated what I suppose Nobile was arguing for. And I'll finish in that. The story could carry on forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a few slides where you left off. Would you put those back on? We're just going to take you from 1928, 1931 up to the present. And what happened? Well, I'll just tell you about the Hindenburg airship disaster, the Zeppelin, which Hitler continued to build Zeppelins. This flew across the Atlantic, moored in New Jersey. It's filled with hydrogen, of course. It caught on fire, 36 people died. This basically was the end of the use of Zeppelins for passenger travel. Now I'm just going to finish. Go ahead, slide please, and talk about one of our Explorers Club members, David Hempelman Adams. He's British. He's the first to fly. He did a hot air balloon from Spitsbergen to North Pole and return. He basically did what Andrée was trying to do. Next slide, please. He's a member of the Explorers Club. He's got the Explorers Club medal. He wrote a book. I love books, you know that. At the Mercy of the Winds, readily available in UK and England and United States. Next slide. And here's his balloon. He had a hot air balloon. He had a basket beneath it, which he was in. Next slide, please. And there he is. He got to the North Pole. And next slide, please. And he got back. Now, how did he do this? Well, he did this through meteorology. He had satellites, he had helicopters, and he found that at some altitudes, the winds blew from south to north, and at other altitudes, they blew from north to south. So him and his meteorologists were 24/7, 5.5 days it took him finding the right altitude to get his balloon so he could fly north to the North Pole and then fly back. Next slide. There he is at the end, landed on the ice. Yeah, next slide. And he was rescued by helicopter and brought back to Great Britain. It's a good ending. It's where he succeeded, where Andrée failed. Thank you very much. That's we'll have time for some questions now. And I just wanted to say it's amazing how we've gone from Seattle to New York to England in milliseconds. And we have people listening from San Diego up to Maine, from England, from Sweden to Norway. This technology is really amazing. So some of the questions, here's a question, Mark. What was the most surprising thing you discovered in your research?
Oh, wow, that is a really good question. I suppose what was the most surprising thing I discovered was, that's a really good, that's utterly floored me, I guess, was I suppose how close airships did come to success and how close their rivalry with fixed wing aircraft went, and how, you know, a few moments of kind of different decision making on the part of Nobile or the crew of the Hindenburg or other airships, or their bosses perhaps would have taken history in a very different way. And I always think that when you see an airship or go to an airship hangar, there's a real sense of that history. A different world is very thin there, and you can almost step into a different world where the airships, are still in the sky.
A question about dogs. You saw Nobile's dog.
Yeah.
Someone asked, did anybody bring dogs on ships to help pull sleds?
Well, that's a good question. I don't recall that. I think Amundsen would have wanted to, because one of the things he and Nobile clashed with was how much equipment did you need to take on the airship in case you crashed. Nobile was obviously very confident, perhaps overconfident in the technology. Amundsen was perhaps pessimistic. So he would have liked to have taken Huskies if he didn't. He certainly was very critical of Nobile taking his dog because he saw the dog was pointless. He couldn't pull the sled. He wasn't even much to eat in the emergency. I think he called it a snack. And he was very furious that Nobile would take up weight and space with that dog. He didn't see any point to it at all.
This question about the Spitsbergen Air Museum. Has anyone actually?
Yeah.
I've been there. Do they have a collection of airships?
Yes, that's a really good. That is a really, really good question. I did have a slide of the museum that I was going to put up because I spent quite a lot of time there when I went to Svalbard. It's a brilliant museum, and I really would say if anyone was going to Svalbard, go to that museum or go there specifically. It's a fantastic collection of original documents and newspaper cuttings and film of all the things we're talking about today, and the stuff are incredibly helpful. So it's a brilliant place. Go there.
But they don't have an airship there.
No, they don't have an airship there at all. I think I don't think there's a single airship of this period actually preserved anywhere. So I'm bound to be proved wrong, but there's little bits here and there. But I don't think that there's a single airship preserved from this golden age of airships.
There is a Friedrichshafen Zeppelin Museum, and Friedrichshafen am Bodensee, and they have parts of Zeppelins there. Any people are just very pleased. They said this is a terrific talk, and they look forward to reading your new book.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yes. And I think that's basically it, but just some very nice comments about this. Yeah. And the people wondered whether Lindbergh or any other people, you mentioned Wilkins, had tried to fly across the North Pole around that time in the 20s.
Lindbergh didn't. Obviously, Richard Byrd, Wilkins flew kind of down to this, kind of flew a similar route. there are lots of expeditions who wanted to, but it defeated many of them didn't kind of get off the ground. If that's not a joke. Interestingly, Richard Byrd almost flew an airship rather than his Fokker trimotor. Goodyear were offering him an airship to fly because they really liked the idea of a Goodyear airship versus the Italian airship. And I think by the time Nobile got to the North Pole, it wasn't such a. It's getting to the point where that's been done so many times before. I think there was a Russian flight in 1938 with the Russian Lindbergh from Moscow to Alaska, and like all great stories we've been talking about today, the plane disappears, and they haven't found any of the wreckage. It was supposed to be the first flight from Moscow over the pole, the route that Amundsen championed, to Alaska, and it disappears.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
They were playing somewhere in Washington State or Oregon or somewhere. Yeah. Okay. One more question. For airships today, do they still need this many people to help land the airships?
Well, that's a good question. If you have a conventional airship, probably like the Goodyear, then you probably still need a fair few people. But they also have vectored thrust, so they can control direction of the thrust more. The hybrid airships that a company called Hybrid Air Vehicles is trying to build in Britain, and also Lockheed, has a kind of a prototype one. They are hybrids, so they're not so they can stay on the ground a little bit more easily, and they also have a cushion around the bottom which actually holds them to the ground, because obviously that's one of the weaknesses of the airship in that sense, is that traditional airship, you need quite a lot of infrastructure on the ground. So hybrid airships you can land without huge numbers of people.
Well, the only airships we see these days are the Goodyear blimps over the golf tournaments.
I mean, you can also, I didn't, because of the pandemic, the Germans are flying, the Goodyears, I think we talked about this last night, are basically Zeppelin designs, and the Germans are flying Zeppelins from Friedrichshafen, I can never pronounce the name.
Friedrichshafen.
That's right. So you can actually book a ticket and fly on the Zeppelin, have dinner on the Zeppelin. From there, there's a few other kind of ones around for experimental purposes. Every now and then, one's singing over California. There's a few experimental airships, a few still used for marketing from other smaller companies. There's more around than you think. And also, one of the Google founders is building a huge airship, apparently hydrogen-filled airship in California as well. That's one of the stories in one of the hangars, hidden away. And I've heard that quite a few airship engineers are working on that project. So it never goes away. But it never succeeds either. So
it costs about $100,000 to fill one of those airships with helium.
Yeah, that's crazy, and a rare gas as well now.
Yeah,
so
it is. All right. Well, thank you very much. We're going to end it tonight. Tomorrow, the Explorers Club has talk on the species among us, women and biodiversity. Wednesday, the innovators. So we're going on, and then the Monday evening talks will resume on September 13th with a very good talk hopefully from St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt. Sinai Peninsula. Mark Phelps will talk about the Sinai palimpsest project. So thank you very much, Mark. And
it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. It was great fun.